It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Dell U2719D. This monitor uses a 27-inch 2560x1440, that's WQHD IPS type panel, and this has a 60Hz refresh rate. As usual, this video accompanies a longer and more detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video. As a video, you have to remember that what you see depends on my camera, it depends on the editing software I use for the video, it depends on YouTube, and ultimately it depends on your own monitor or the screen that you're viewing the video on. So what you see doesn't represent exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. The 2560x1440 resolution gives you good multitasking potential, or indeed gives you a good amount of space if you just want to work on a single document or whatever else you might be doing. It also offers a nice pixel density, a good level of detail and clarity for text, but also images, suitably high resolution images, and other content such as games. Speaking of clarity, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the screen surface. It's a bit different to some of the older ultra-sharp models. The panel used on this one actually has a medium or relatively light, depending on how you classify it, matte anti-glare screen surface. So on the plus side, this handles glare better than some of the older ultra-sharp models with their light matte anti-glare screen surfaces or very light matte anti-glare screen surfaces. So you should always try and avoid direct light striking the screen surface directly, and you should always avoid having your room lighting too bright, regardless of the screen surface. But it does give you a bit more flexibility. You don't have to worry so much about glare. On the flip side, it does have a bit of an effect on image clarity, but it isn't a major effect. The screen surface has a reasonably smooth finish to it. It doesn't have a kind of obvious smeary graininess when you're observing lighter shades such as white. There's a sort of light misty graininess, and it doesn't have a kind of thick layered appearance to the graininess either. So in terms of the vibrancy and clarity, it is preserved better than some matte screen surfaces. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So the first thing to note is it has very slender bezels. They have a dual stage bezel design, or 4-side borderless if you prefer. And this has a slim panel border, so you can see that kind of black border, and that'll be around the image. If the monitor's on, you can see the image inside there. And then there's also a very thin, hard plastic outer component. But those components together are still very slim, and the bottom bezel as well, it's slightly thicker, but not much. It's still very slender still. So that's good for multi-monitor setups and that kind of thing. The stand base is not too deep. It has quite a compact design, which means you can put it quite close to the wall. And the screen also sits a little bit back from the front of the stand base, so you can put it nice and close to the wall, which is good for users who don't have a massive amount of desk space. The main feature to note from the front is the medium or relatively light, depending on how you choose to classify it, matte anti-glare screen surface. This offers good glare handling, and it does have an impact on the image, which I explore a bit later and I've mentioned a bit already. The included stand offers full ergonomic flexibility, so you can adjust the height of the monitor. You can also swivel it left and right. And you can tilt it backwards and forwards. You can also rotate it into portrait mode, and that's either clockwise or anti-clockwise. It goes both ways. Just make sure, as usual, you tilt it back a little bit so you don't scrape your desk whilst doing this. Has a nice smooth adjustment for that. So it's in portrait now. In keeping with its very slender bezel design, it's also slim from the side. You can see that the stand itself isn't particularly bulky, nor is the screen. It's about as thin as you can actually get from a screen with an internal power converter. There's also a little USB hub on the left side as viewed from the front. So there are two USB 3 ports, and the bottom port there supports BC 1.2 fast charging. I've got the monitor in portrait now, so I can look at the ports more closely. There's an AC power input, which means the monitor has an internal power converter. There is an HDMI 1.4 port, a DisplayPort 1.4 input, a DisplayPort 1.4 output which has an orange plug over it, and that's just so you don't confuse it with an input, and that's for MST daisy chaining purposes. There's a 3.5mm audio output, there is a USB 3 upstream port, and there are two USB 3 downstream ports, and the second one there has BC 1.2 fast charging, so that means there are 4 USB 3 downstream ports in total. At the rear of the monitor, it's mainly matte silver. You can see as well that the stand base is matte silver, the stand neck is matte silver. I didn't mention before, but it's matte black at the front of the stand neck, and there's matte black towards the bottom. The stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so you press that button there and you can take the screen off, and then you can use an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA compatible mount. There is a Kensington lock slot, and if you'd like to, there's also a little sort of button underneath there between the HDMI and the display port. I'll show you the port shortly. They face downwards, so I'll show you the monitor in portrait when I'm showing off the ports. It makes it a little bit easier. But there is actually a little button you can press between the HDMI and display port. You need to use a pen or something thin to press that, and that'll just lock the stand release so you can't easily press that. Then if you press that button again, it'll sort of release the stand release button. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor has an IPS type panel and has a specified contrast of 1000:1. I measured quite close to this. It depends on the settings you're using. If you're using the full factory calibration in the standard mode, it does come close to 1000:1. With the adjustments I made to my test settings, which uses the custom colour with a few adjustments, I actually measured a little bit above 1000:1. As an IPS panel, there is IPS glow, and the amount of IPS glow is moderate. It's quite average for an IPS type model of this size, and what that means is you do get a bit of a kind of hazing towards the bottom of the screen in particular from a normal viewing position, and that eats away at some of the detail and causes a kind of bit of a bloom effect there. Anyone who's seen an IPS model or seen enough sort of videos and photos of this will kind of know what this looks like, and you can certainly see it in the video a bit towards the bottom corners in particular. And because the static contrast isn't amazingly strong, it's not like a really strong VA panel or anything, the dark elements don't have the kind of excellent atmosphere you might get from some models, and especially if you're viewing in a darker room, as I am now. As far as IPS models go without sort of HDR and a fancy backlighting technology, really it's about as good as you're going to get. And in terms of the bright elements, they do contrast nicely with the darker surroundings. So the sort of bright daylight here certainly stands out well against the darker interior parts of this particular scene I'm showing you. And if you do observe the lighter shades, you won't be able to see this on the video, but you can see a sort of misty graininess. It doesn't look completely smooth. The bright sky up there, for example, has a little bit of a misty graininess to it, but it's not heavy smeary graininess, as I mentioned before. In terms of the detail levels, when observing dark content, they're good overall. As I've already mentioned, there is some IPS glow which affects peripheral detail, particularly in the bottom region of the screen, but elsewhere the detail levels are largely as they should be, and it does depend on the settings you're using on the monitor. With my test settings, there's a little bit of extra masking of detail versus what there ideally would be. If you use the standard mode, which is the full factory calibration, the detail levels actually improve, but they don't improve as in look ridiculous and give a sort of blocky or banded appearance to dark areas. It's just that Dell sort of carefully tuned the gamma curve to slightly elevate the darker shades. And on a monitor with a contrast of around 1000:1 like this has, and with an IPS panel with the IPS glow taken into account, this can sort of counteract some of the natural detail loss you'd get. So some users will definitely like that look, and it's certainly, I can see the appeal. I don't really mind. My test settings, I employ them for other reasons, and I'll explore that a bit more in the colour reproduction section. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, And I like to start this section off with the Lagom tests for viewing angles. That's lagom.nl, the website. The text test is good for showing if there are obvious issues to the gamma curve of the monitor in terms of its viewing angle dependency. On IPS type models like this, you typically see very low amount of viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve, and this model is no exception. So with the Lagom text test, you can kind of see quite a blended grey appearance. There's a little bit of red to the striping in places, sort of more so lower down the screen, and that doesn't always come out in the video, so it might not be clear, but overall it's a sort of blended grey appearance. If there are weaknesses in terms of the viewing angle, you'll see them quite readily on this test, because you'll see the kind of flashes of stronger green hue to the striping in places, a more saturated red hue, and sort of a transition between that with a kind of orange colour. And that often shifts as you move your head movement, particularly on TN panels. You'll see a very clear shift as you move your head. On this, there isn't such an issue. If you're observing solid shades as well, so you can see a nice purple screen fill. This just looks a kind of bluish purple throughout. There's kind of a small amount of pink tint towards the very edge, but overall it's quite a consistent bluish purple, and there isn't a kind of strong pink tint which moves around if you move your head or camera movement. And again, on the video you might see some sort of shifting pink hue, but that's really just from the video and how the camera captures things. The red block appears a fairly vibrant red, and it doesn't have a kind of more pink hue or an obvious pinkening or a faded appearance in some sections or more vibrant in others. And again, you'd get that if there are weaknesses with viewing angle performance and colour consistency. The green block, a really nice, solid, slightly yellowish green. It's not sort of a solid, pure green, and that's because of the colour gamut of the monitor. It doesn't extend much beyond sRGB, but it does have quite a vibrant appearance, this colour, and it looks quite consistent. There isn't any sort of localised yellowing. The blue block, and that appears a nice royal blue throughout. I'm now on Battlefield 5. I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. As I'd shown you with Lagom, and I talked about with Lagom, colour consistency is very good on this monitor, and that means that an appropriate level of saturation is maintained throughout the screen. So overall things look vibrant, not just sort of in the central region of the screen, and with TNs you'll get kind of a lessening saturation lower down and a sort of deepening higher up, and with VA models you can get that sort of towards the edges and bottom of the screen, changes in saturation. So things look rich throughout. The colour gamut extends a bit beyond sRGB, so that gives a little bit of an edge in terms of vibrancy, but nothing extreme. So saturation levels are really quite good. There are some nice vibrant elements such as the fire here. It sort of stands out in a nice way, but it has a really nice shade variety as well. There's a really good variety of oranges and reds and yellows within the fire, and it all looks nice and natural. It doesn't look ridiculous. The factory calibration for this model is actually very good, and certainly on my unit it was really quite difficult to fault, to be honest. It is the kind of model, at least if they all are calibrated as mine was, and I think from what I've seen from users, you can't expect a very good factory calibration. You can really just lower the brightness a bit and you're pretty much good to go. If you want a greater level of accuracy, having a calibration using your own colorimeter, it's always advised. I mean, if you're doing color critical work, definitely consider investing in a colorimeter or that kind of device. It will help, and monitors do sort of have changes over time, and even if the factory calibration is perfect or close to it, there will be some changes over time, and it's good to recalibrate the monitor yourself. But this slight extension beyond sRGB, I have that in my test settings, and that's actually why I use custom color, because this uses the full native gamut of the monitor. I've used a lot of monitors recently which have quite a bit of extension beyond sRGB, some of them more than this, sort of come close to DCI-P3, and I actually quite like that look. It's not for everyone. Some people find it looks kind of oversaturated. They prefer a more natural, more muted appearance to the image. But if you use the full factory calibration, sRGB tracking, it's actually very close to the sRGB gamut. So that does tone things down a little bit, but things do still look rich. And as I've mentioned, the colour consistency is good, so they're sort of rich throughout the screen and very nicely represented in a rich, natural and accurate looking way. But as I've said, a little bit of extension with my test settings, nothing extreme. And with that, things certainly do look in place, but there are some sort of extra elements of vibrancy in places. And I like to show this scene when I'm talking about colour reproduction because there are some really nice autumnal browns and a nice variety of natural green and brown shades. And this monitor certainly displays them in a very nice way, really good variety. And because of the strong consistency, you get a kind of nice variety of subtly different green shades and brown shades. And that kind of individuality is lost with the model with much weaker colour consistency. There's not really much more to say about the colour reproduction. It's very good if you're after a sort of slightly rich looking image with a bit of extra vibrancy. You can sort of set the monitor up appropriately. If you prefer things to just track really quite closely to sRGB and look consistently rich but more natural and accurately represented without even sort of much, if any, oversaturation, you can set it up like that as well, just with the full factory calibration. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. There's an important concept to understand when it comes to monitor responsiveness called perceived blur, and that's summarised in the written review and also covered in more detail in a dedicated article on the topic of responsiveness on the website. But essentially, perceived blur is caused primarily by eye movement as you track motion on the screen, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display and the frame rate you're running at, up to a maximum of that. This is a 60Hz monitor and I'm running the game at 60 frames a second, so I'm sort of using the maximum potential as I can with the monitor at its standard 60Hz refresh rate. There's a moderate amount of perceived blur due to eye movement, and that would be the case regardless of how fast the monitor itself is, so regardless of the pixel responsiveness. The pixel responsiveness is another aspect which affects perceived blur, and on this model the pixel responses are pretty decent overall. They're certainly much in line with what I've seen on most other IPS models of this refresh rate, and it means that most of the perceived blur is indeed due to eye movement, and there's not really a great deal of sort of additional trailing or ghosting, whatever you want to call it, on top of that due to slower than optimal pixel responses. There are some slight sort of weaknesses in the pixel responses, particularly where you've got these kind of higher contrast transitions, such as the very sort of dark shadowy areas here versus the brighter sky in the background. It creates a little bit of what I call powdery trailing, sort of a light powdery trailing or perhaps a moderate powdery trailing depending on the transition. But this isn't particularly eye-catching. It isn't like the kind of smeary trailing you get on some VA models, for example. There are some sort of other examples of that, but this particular scene on Battlefield 5 is quite useful because it does have quite a lot of high contrast transitions, but plenty of sort of lower contrast transitions as well, so a good mixture of transitions. So this little thing that says E to pick up a letter, that shows some of these weaker transitions as well, and again there's a little bit of a powdery trail and what I actually call breakup trailing, and that is whereby some shades in the background or the object colour, the object being E pick up the letter in this case and the background being the wall, there are some shades in that which kind of sort of break into the trailing. So it has a kind of a slight green quality to it, and that's sort of what you get when you mix some of the background colours there. There are some sort of greeny browns with the wall there mixed in with the white, so that's kind of what that trailing is. But again, it's not particularly eye-catching, and this is just a sort of isolated example of this. Overall, the pixel responses are good enough for an optimal 60Hz performance on this monitor. We'll just give it a sort of a very slight weakness beyond that. So as far as 60Hz models go, it's quite good in that respect. The input lag of this model is also pretty low. I measured around 6 milliseconds, I think, off the top of my head. So it has quite a low level of input lag, lower than the Dell U2719D, the predecessor to this model, the immediate predecessor. So it does have quite a low level of input lag if you're interested in that kind of thing. I'm not going to say it has an amazing connected feel because again you've only got a 60Hz refresh rate to play with here. You can also overclock this monitor, and as I say in the written review, mileage may indeed vary in that respect, but I was able to get my monitor up to 74Hz with a custom resolution on my NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti, and this does give a little bit of an edge in the connected feel. When I say connected feel, that describes how it feels when you interact with the game world and the character, the sort of fluidity and precision you feel. It's separate to input lag, although input lag does, of course, affect the connected feel. This particular aspect of connected feel I'm talking about is really highly linked to the refresh rate and the frame rate that you're running at. So I've got 74Hz at the moment, 74 frames a second, and compared to 60Hz, I do notice a bit of an improvement in the connected feel. A more minor improvement, you also get a little bit lower perceived blur, and that's because the eye movement is reduced, and being the key contributor to perceived blur on this monitor, that does decrease it. But again, those sort of weaknesses in pixel responses, they exist. And actually, some of the trailing is a little bit more obvious now. I say a little bit more obvious, it just kind of extends a little bit further out. I'd recommend looking at the Test UFO Pursuit photographs on the written review for sort of a more focused look at how this actually affects the image. But it's really just a kind of slightly more extended powdery trail. It doesn't really catch the eye. But as I say, the overall perceived blur is reduced, and particularly you kind of notice that at faster turns of the character. But this is still at 74Hz. It's not a massive difference from 60Hz, so there's really quite slight differences. And if you do overclock the monitor, it doesn't really dramatically change the image quality or anything like that, so you can do that. But if you do overclock the monitor, and that's the kind of thing you like to do, just be aware that it does introduce these static interlace patterns, and again they're explored in the written review, but you kind of can see some shades break into thin horizontal bands of an alternating slightly lighter and darker version of the intended shades, particularly noticeable on lighter shades, but some darker shades as well. And not everyone will notice this, and it's not obvious even at 74Hz on this model, but it's just something to be aware of, and I do cover that in the written review. To wrap up then, as I've come to expect from models in Dell's ultra-sharp series, the design of the monitor is quite minimalistic, quite stylish in some ways, but doesn't have any kind of loud and proud features. It has a nice sensible stand design. It's robust enough, it offers good ergonomic flexibility and doesn't take up a massive amount of space on the desk. The bezels are slender, they're thinner than the older ultra-sharp models, particularly if you go as far back as the U2719H. The bezels have certainly got a bit thinner than that. The contrast of the monitor, largely as I'd expect from an IPS type panel, around 1000 to 1, static contrast and a bit of IPS glow, quite a normal amount of IPS glow for an IPS type panel of the size. That does eat away at some of the peripheral detail, but it's pretty much an expectation for this kind of panel. One aspect to note in terms of contrast and just the overall image itself, the screen surface is a bit different to many of the slightly older ultra sharps, including the U2719D, U2715H and U2713HM, if we're going that far back. They all had a light matte or very light matte anti-glare screen surface. This model uses a medium or relatively light matte anti-glare screen surface. So that means the glare handling is improved. It also means that the image has a slight graininess to it when you're observing white shades or lighter shades. But this graininess is not extreme by any means. It doesn't really bother me, and I'm quite sensitive to screen surface. I've been using some models recently which have a more noticeable graininess to the screen surface. The colour reproduction, even taking the screen surface into account, it's rich overall, it has some good vibrant elements, has a very natural look, and the factory calibration of this model really is excellent. Certainly this was the case on the unit I tested, and from user feedback it does seem to offer a good strong factory calibration in the standard mode. So if you don't have a colorimeter and you're wanting to use this model for colour critical work, absolutely feel free to do so. It's a good model for that kind of use. If you do have your own colorimeter, that's the best way to maintain good colour accuracy over time as well, because things do change. Even if the monitor has a really good factory calibration, you might want to recalibrate it in time as things shift a bit to make sure you're always getting a good level of accuracy. And for general purpose use as well, including gaming, I found the colour output nice and vibrant. There's a bit of extension beyond sRGB, so there's a little bit of extra vibrancy, but nothing extreme, so it does maintain a natural look to the image with some nice vibrant elements as well. The responsiveness of the monitor, it's a 60Hz monitor, there's not too much to say about it. The 60Hz refresh rate was really the main barrier to responsiveness. You could overclock it to 74Hz, or I could on my unit. That sort of gives a slight edge, but nothing extreme. There were no massive weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. There's a tiny amount of overshoot in places, and I do mean a tiny amount. Even if I pointed this out to people in person, they wouldn't notice it, so didn't really make a big thing of that in the video review or the written review. Some slight weaknesses in pixel responsiveness in terms of giving a little bit of powder trailing in places, but nothing eye-catching or extreme. Overall then, I feel the Dell U2719D is a good addition to the ultra-sharp series. It offers strong all-round performance, a decent design which won't annoy users because it's quite simple and inoffensive, and it comes at a decent price. It's not stupidly expensive, it's not sort of suspiciously cheap either. Also note that some retailers sell this as the U2719DX, and that includes an HDMI cable instead of a DisplayPort cable, but it's otherwise the same product. There's also the U2719DC, which includes USB Type-C ports. So that's really all there is to the Dell U2719D. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.